The most beautiful sounds sometimes do not arise from perfect keys, but are hidden deep within the silence of things cast away by the world. For 42 years, Abram Gallagher poured the sweat of his youth into the foundation of a 2-story wooden house. He was a 75-year-old former structural engineer, a man who possessed the calm, calculating eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring the load-bearing capacity of steel beams and the exact thickness of concrete pillars down to the fraction of an inch. He had framed every wall of this home, driving thousands of pounds of iron nails into solid oak studs, creating a fortress meant to protect his family from the harshness of the world. Beside him on the dying front lawn stood his wife, Cora. She was a 72-year-old former piano teacher, a woman of immense, quiet grace. Her hands, once capable of flying across ivory keys with breathtaking speed, now hung heavily at her sides. The knuckles were swollen, the joints painfully deformed by 5 relentless years of aggressive arthritis that had stolen her ability to play. They stood in absolute silence. On the front porch stood their eldest son, Desmond. He was 45 years old, wearing a crisp, tailored charcoal suit and a heavy gold watch that caught the morning sunlight, standing in nauseating contrast to Abram's faded flannel shirt, denim jeans, and scuffed leather work boots. Desmond possessed a cold, pragmatic heart. He had quietly forged the necessary signatures, liquidated his parents' retirement accounts, and finalized the sale of the family estate under the hypocritical guise of a financial reorganization meant to distribute wealth fairly among his brothers. It was a sterile, calculated eviction, executed with the ruthless precision of a corporate raider stripping a bankrupt company for parts. A heavy, sickening thud echoed from the main hallway. 2 burly, impatient movers shoved a polished mahogany upright piano through the front door. It was the exact instrument Cora had faithfully played for 31 years, the very soul of her living room, now being unceremoniously carted away like a worthless pile of scrap lumber. The heavy brass casters scraped violently against the original oak floorboards, leaving deep, jagged gouges in the wood that Abram had sanded and varnished by hand decades ago. The men tipped the heavy instrument sideways, letting it slam against the porch railing with a discordant, agonizing crash of vibrating strings. Cora did not flinch. She did not scream, she did not plead, and she absolutely did not shed a single tear of weakness or self-pity. She simply watched the men load the heavy instrument into the cavernous back of a rusted moving truck, her stoic posture radiating a quiet, unbreakable dignity that towered over her son's greed. Abram placed a calloused, grease-stained hand gently on her shoulder, the rough texture of his palm offering the only shelter she needed against the biting wind. He picked up 2 battered leather suitcases. The closing paperwork is done, and the funds are secured in a family trust for the siblings, Desmond said coldly, adjusting his silk tie without daring to make direct eye contact with his father. Abram looked at the man he had raised, a man who had traded his soul for a temporary ledger balance. Abram did not raise his voice, nor did he hurl desperate insults into the crisp autumn air. "Do not ever look for us," Abram stated, with a voice as steady as bedrock. He guided Cora down the long driveway, the loose gravel crunching softly beneath their weary feet. They climbed into their rusted 15-year-old sedan, the heavy metal doors shutting with a hollow metallic clank that sealed off their past. The engine sputtered to life, coughing a thick cloud of gray exhaust into the 40-degree Fahrenheit air, a bitter, biting temperature that seeped relentlessly through the thin floor mats and chilled their bones. Abram sat behind the steering wheel, his rough hands gripping the cracked leather. Before shifting into gear, he reached into his faded chest pocket and pulled out a frayed, weather-beaten brown wallet. His thick, trembling fingers slowly separated the worn leather folds, staring down into the dark pocket to assess the absolute totality of his financial existence after 40 years of honest, back-breaking labor. $64. He pulled out the crumpled bills and counted them with a quiet, devastating meticulousness. 3 $20 bills and 4 single-dollar bills. It was a pathetic, insulting sum, a cruel joke played by a flesh-and-blood son who had systematically stripped them of their sanctuary, their savings, and their safety net. Abram carefully folded the bills back into the leather. He shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the suburban cul-de-sac, never once looking back in the rearview mirror at the magnificent house he had built with his own 2 hands. They drove aimlessly toward the east, the tires humming a monotonous, droning tune against the cracked asphalt. The highway stretched out ahead of them like an endless gray ribbon, carrying them further and further away from everything they had ever loved and lost. They drove in complete silence for 3 grueling hours. They crossed invisible county lines, passing hundreds of miles of barren, frozen farm fields, collapsed barns, and rust-eaten wire fences that sagged under the weight of neglected, overgrown acres. The fuel gauge needle dipped dangerously below the red line, forcing Abram to exit the main highway and navigate down a narrow, pothole-ridden county road that rattled the very frame of their dying car. They limped into Caulfield, a miserable, dying town entirely forgotten by the march of time. It was a desolate stretch of boarded-up storefronts, crumbling brick facades, and rusted street lamps that leaned precariously over the cracked sidewalks. Abram pulled the sputtering sedan up to a lonely, dirt-stained gas pump sitting in front of a run-down diner. He stepped out of the vehicle, the freezing wind whipping fiercely against his tired face, and prepared to hand over his final desperate dollars just to keep the engine running for a few more miles. He walked slowly toward the glass diner door. He had absolutely no idea that a faded, rain-stained flyer, stapled carelessly near a rotting wooden bulletin board near the entrance, was quietly waiting for him, a fragile piece of paper that was about to violently and irreversibly shift the heavy gears of their destiny forever. The icy wind howled relentlessly against the cracked, frost-covered glass of Rose's Diner, a miserable little establishment fighting a losing battle against the bitter elements. Inside the dimly lit room, the rusted iron heating vents rattled violently, blowing a weak, lukewarm breeze that barely fought off the 40-degree Fahrenheit chill settling deep into their weary, aging bones. Abram and Cora sat completely still in a torn vinyl booth, their exhausted faces illuminated by the flickering, sickly yellow glow of a dying fluorescent bulb buzzing incessantly overhead. On the scratched laminate table sat a single, chipped ceramic mug filled to the brim with bitter, scalding black coffee. They shared it in absolute silence. Cora wrapped her deformed, swollen fingers around the warm porcelain, closing her eyes as the faint heat radiated into her damaged joints, offering a fleeting, desperate illusion of comfort. Beside the mug lay a meager, pathetic pile of loose change. Abram had meticulously counted out exactly $1.45 to pay Mildred, the 60-year-old diner owner who wiped down the adjacent counters with a damp rag, casting gentle, sorrowful glances toward the quiet couple. Abram stood up, his heavy joints popping, and walked slowly toward the restrooms. His sharp, measuring eyes locked onto a corkboard hanging crookedly on the peeling plaster wall. A faded yellow paper, curling at the torn edges and stained by years of water damage, demanded his unwavering attention. It was a county foreclosure notice, tacked carelessly beneath a thick layer of gray dust. The property was a massive, decaying Victorian mansion located 2 miles away at the dead end of Prosper Street, originally constructed in 1890 and completely abandoned for 60 agonizing years.
The town rumors labeled it a cursed, haunted tomb, a completely useless structure sitting on half an acre of overgrown dead weeds. The starting bid was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink: $12. The next morning, the imposing stone halls of the county courthouse smelled of stale floor wax, cheap cologne, and the palpable, suffocating arrogance of local real estate developers. Abram and Cora stood silently in the back of the crowded, echoing auction room, remaining completely invisible among the wealthy men wearing tailored wool coats and expensive leather loafers. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a booming, theatrical voice, stepped up to the podium and slammed his heavy wooden gavel down against the sounding block. He scoffed openly, leaning into the microphone to describe the Prosper Street property not as a home, but as a severe, unmitigated liability, a rotting pile of garbage with collapsing floorboards, shattered glass, and absolutely no running water, sewage lines, or electricity. The crowd erupted in cruel, mocking laughter. Local investors shook their heads, whispering harsh insults and casting pathetic, pitying glances toward the filthy, ruined structure projected on a white canvas screen. Nobody in their right mind wanted to inherit an absolute nightmare, a collapsing hazard of rotting wood that would cost thousands of dollars just to demolish and haul away to the county landfill. Abram raised his calloused, weather-beaten right hand. The massive room went dead silent. "I bid $12, Abram stated calmly. His voice carried no fear, slicing through the heavy, judgmental air with the sharp, uncompromising edge of a steel blade. Not a single soul dared to challenge the bid, the wealthy investors merely staring at the old man in worn denim with an insulting mixture of amusement and profound pity. The auctioneer sighed heavily, rolling his eyes before striking the gavel down with a sharp, dismissive crack. Abram walked forward with steady, measured steps, his posture radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity as he ignored the sneers of the townsfolk who viewed him as nothing more than a foolish, desperate beggar. He reached into his frayed chest pocket. He placed exactly one $5 bill, 7 crisp $1 bills, and 0 cents onto the polished mahogany desk, watching the clerk slide a heavy, rusted iron key across the counter. They drove their sputtering sedan 2 miles down the cracked, weed-choked pavement of Prosper Street. The massive mansion loomed at the absolute end of the road like a dark, decaying skeleton, its intricate wooden trim rotting away, its tall, shattered windows staring back at them like hollow, lifeless eyes. The massive front porch sagged under its own immense weight, the floorboards groaning in violent protest as Abram stepped on the damp, moss-covered wood. He slid the heavy iron key into the rusted lock. The ancient mechanism fought back with a harsh, grinding scrape of metal on metal, requiring Abram to press his shoulder against the door and use the full brute strength of his 75-year-old body just to force the tumblers to turn. The massive oak door creaked open. The air was thick, suffocating, and instantly overwhelming, carrying the heavy, undisturbed scent of damp earth and 60 years of absolute decay. But as Abram stepped over the threshold, ignoring the cobwebs brushing against his face, his eyes immediately began scanning the massive load-bearing columns, the thickness of the plaster walls, and the heavy, exposed ceiling joists above his head. And that ancient, dusty smell did not bring fear. It immediately awakened a sharp, relentless engineering intuition deep within his mind.
Abram walked through the heavy front threshold, sweeping the dull yellow beam of his heavy metal flashlight across a massive foyer buried beneath decades of forgotten, undisturbed debris. He stepped carefully over dangerous piles of shattered window glass, crumbling horsehair plaster that had fallen from the ceiling like a dirty snowstorm, and thick layers of black mold creeping relentlessly up the intricately carved wooden baseboards. The house was entirely silent. To the untrained eye of a foolish town resident, the Victorian structure was a terrifying, rotting corpse of a building destined only for the wrecking ball. But to the calculating, experienced mind of a man who had spent 42 years reading architectural blueprints and bearing the immense weight of heavy steel structures, this ruined mansion was screaming a completely different truth. Abram had seen thousands of modern homes built by greedy, profit-driven contractors using cheap pine and chemical adhesives, fragile illusions of wealth that would rot away in 20 years, much like the fake, hollow life his treacherous son Desmond had chosen to build. This house was different. The bones were absolute perfection. He crouched down on his knees, ignoring the sharp pain in his joints as he pressed his calloused, dirt-stained palms against the massive 12-inch by 12-inch solid oak floor joists running beneath the shattered parlor floorboards. He walked slowly down the creaking wooden stairs into the pitch-black, damp cellar, tracing his rough fingers along the massive limestone blocks that formed a heavy, 10-foot-tall foundation wall deeply rooted into the frozen earth. There was not a single fraction of an inch of settlement, no horizontal cracking in the mortar, and no dangerous bowing in the heavy masonry, despite sitting completely abandoned against 60 years of freezing Ohio winters and torrential summer rains. Night fell over the dead town, dropping the temperature inside the unheated house down to a bitter 38 degrees Fahrenheit. They slept on the hard, unyielding floor of the main living room, wrapped tightly together beneath a single frayed wool blanket they had salvaged from the trunk of their dying car. The wind howled violently outside, violently rattling the loose window panes and sending freezing drafts across their faces, but Abram held his wife firmly against his chest, using his own body heat to shield her from the biting cold. They did not complain. The next morning, as the pale, gray sunlight finally filtered through the shattered bay windows, Cora walked slowly through the massive front room. She ignored the dead leaves, the scattered animal bones, and the thick, suffocating layers of dust covering the beautiful hardwood, her quiet eyes drawn entirely to a single, decaying wooden bench sitting completely isolated in the exact center of the vast space. It was an antique piano bench, crafted from heavy, dark mahogany, its faded leather cushion cracked and peeling violently from decades of extreme, unregulated humidity. The room was utterly empty. Yet as she knelt down with agonizing slowness, ignoring the sharp shooting pain radiating through her severely inflamed knee joints, she brushed away a thick mound of black dirt to reveal 4 distinct circular depressions crushed deep into the oak floorboards. They were heavy, precise indentations spaced exactly 5 feet and 2 inches apart, forming the unmistakable permanent scars left behind by the massive brass casters of a magnificent grand piano. A profound, overwhelming wave of silent understanding washed over her chest, whispering through the cold air that this decaying, forgotten tomb had once been a sacred sanctuary for a gentle soul who loved music just as deeply as she did. It was a grand piano, Cora whispered softly, her deformed fingers trembling slightly as she traced the empty air above the floor. A heavy one, Abram replied calmly, his deep, steady voice vibrating against the peeling wallpaper. While Cora sat silently on the decaying bench, lost in the quiet echoes of a forgotten melody, Abram carried his heavy flashlight up the winding, creaking wooden staircase to continue his meticulous assessment of the massive structure. He inspected the dark, narrow second floor, testing the load-bearing capacity of every single bedroom doorframe, finding absolutely nothing but solid, unyielding craftsmanship hidden beneath peeling, toxic layers of cheap lead paint. He continued his steady, methodical climb upward, stepping onto the narrow, suffocating landing of the 3rd floor, where the ceiling sloped down sharply under the heavy, dramatic pitch of the Victorian roof. The hallway was dead silent, tight, and suffocatingly dark.
He walked slowly down the narrow corridor, trailing his rough, dirt-stained fingertips against the left wall, reading the structural framing hidden entirely behind the plaster with the flawless intuition of a master builder. He stopped dead in his tracks at the very end of the hall, staring directly at a flat, unremarkable barrier. His eyes narrowed sharply. He stepped much closer to the flat, solid wall that supposedly marked the absolute end of the house's architecture, raising his heavy flashlight to illuminate a faded, water-stained floral wallpaper running from the floorboards all the way up to the ceiling. His breathing slowed to a deliberate, rhythmic pace as his highly trained eyes detected a nearly invisible vertical seam running straight down the plaster, a tiny, seemingly insignificant structural flaw where the delicate petals of the painted roses were misaligned by exactly half an inch. It was a false wall. He tapped his heavy, calloused knuckles against the solid plaster, listening intently as the dull, flat thud suddenly gave way to a deep, echoing resonance that sent a violent shiver down his spine. A hollow, haunting sound, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that an entirely hidden space, sealed completely off from the outside world for over 60 years, was quietly waiting just inches away.
The morning frost melted into a freezing, miserable drizzle, soaking the rotting wooden shingles of the Victorian roof. Abram did not stop working. He climbed a rusted 32-foot aluminum extension ladder, his heavy leather work boots gripping the slippery, moss-covered rungs with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who absolutely refused to be broken by the heavy weight of exhaustion. He carried a heavy canvas tool belt loaded with 20 pounds of forged steel hammers, heavy iron nails, and a solid brass tape measure, the thick leather strap biting violently into his 75-year-old waist. He crawled across the dangerous, sagging roofline, ignoring the sharp shooting pains radiating down his aging spine, his heavily calloused hands bleeding slightly as he ripped away the decaying, waterlogged wood. He replaced the compromised sections piece by piece, ensuring every single rafter was spaced exactly 16 inches on center, driving 3-inch galvanized steel nails deep into the solid oak with punishing rhythmic strikes. Down below, inside the freezing parlor, Cora knelt on the hard floorboards. Her fingers were severely deformed by arthritis, her joints swollen and completely incapable of closing into a proper fist, yet she silently scrubbed the heavy, suffocating layers of black grime from the ancient wood, using a stiff bristled brush and a metal bucket of freezing, soapy water. They worked in absolute, punishing silence. They did not complain about their traitorous son, who sat comfortably in his 72-degree Fahrenheit corporate office. They did not cry over their stolen retirement funds, and they did not curse the bitter 38-degree wind whipping fiercely through the shattered window panes. They simply endured. Their suffering was transformed entirely into a stoic, relentless physical labor, their quiet dignity forming an impenetrable fortress that no amount of greed, cruelty, or familial betrayal could ever hope to breach. Across the muddy, pothole-ridden expanse of Prosper Street, a 17-year-old boy stood silently on the sagging porch of a dilapidated single-story house. His name was Leo. He wore a faded, oversized canvas jacket, his hands shoved deep into his frayed pockets as he watched the old man swing a heavy framing hammer with relentless mechanical precision. Leo had dropped out of the local high school 3 agonizing months ago, sacrificing his own fleeting youth and future prospects to stay home and care for his severely bedridden grandmother, a quiet, suffering woman slowly losing her brutal battle against a devastating illness. Leo fully understood the crushing, heavy weight of absolute despair, the isolating, suffocating feeling of being entirely forgotten by a society completely obsessed with superficial wealth and instant gratification.
He had watched local contractors and wealthy real estate developers drive past their dying neighborhood in expensive, heated trucks, casting looks of pure, unadulterated disgust at the rotting houses and the desperate people living inside them. But he had never seen anyone like Abram. For 3 grueling days, Leo stood in the freezing dampness and watched the old man battle the dying mansion without a single word of frustration crossing his lips. He watched Abram haul heavy 80-pound bags of concrete mix across the uneven, frozen yard, his faded flannel shirt completely drenched in dark, heavy sweat, despite the freezing temperature that turned his breath into thick white clouds. The boy felt a deep, unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a profound, overwhelming respect for a man who answered the brutal cruelty of life, not with useless screams, pathetic tears, or bitter complaints, but with the quiet, dignified swing of a steel hammer and the unyielding strength of his own back. Leo crossed the street. He walked slowly up the crumbling dirt driveway, stepping carefully over the scattered piles of dangerous, rust-covered nails and shattered glass, and stood silently at the base of the towering aluminum ladder. Abram paused his rhythmic hammering, looking down at the skinny, hesitant boy with sharp, calculating eyes that immediately assessed the heavy burden carried on the teenager's thin shoulders. "I can carry the heavy wood," Leo said quietly, looking down at his worn canvas sneakers. Abram did not offer a patronizing smile, nor did he dismiss the boy with empty, polite words of false gratitude. He slowly climbed down the heavy aluminum ladder, his heavy boots hitting the frozen dirt with a loud, grounding thud. He looked at the boy's thin, trembling arms, then looked directly into his tired, weary eyes, recognizing the exact same silent, heavy determination for survival that burned fiercely within his own chest. "Grab the heavy steel pry bar," Abram instructed calmly. For the next 2 weeks, the dead, silent property transformed entirely into an uncompromising theater of stoic, methodical labor. Leo arrived precisely at 6 o'clock every single morning, carrying massive 12-foot planks of reclaimed timber, hauling away hundreds of pounds of shattered plaster in a rusted metal wheelbarrow, and learning the brutal, unforgiving rhythm of a hard day's honest work. Abram did not have any money to pay the boy. He could not hand him crisp $20 bills or offer him empty, hollow promises of future wealth. So he made the conscious decision to pay him with something far more valuable and enduring. He paid him in absolute precision. The world will try to force you to accept crooked lines and weak foundations. They will tell you that a fraction of an inch does not matter, that you can simply hide your careless mistakes behind cheap paint, false words, and deceptive smiles. Do not ever believe them. He handed the heavy metal tool down to Leo. "Read the bubble," Abram commanded softly. Leo pressed the freezing cold metal against the rough pine board, staring intently at the small liquid-filled vial encased in the absolute center of the heavy aluminum frame. The tiny green bubble floated slightly to the left of the precise black indicator lines, revealing a dangerous fundamental flaw in the vertical alignment of the heavy wooden post. "It is out of plumb," Leo answered with a newfound quiet confidence. "Then we tear it completely down and build it again," Abram replied without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. They tore down the heavy wood and rebuilt the frame, driving the massive steel nails perfectly straight into the solid grain until the alignment was completely flawless. They worked relentlessly until their muscles screamed in sheer agony, until their hands were covered in deep, bleeding blisters, and until the dark, freezing night swallowed the ruined town whole. Their grueling, back-breaking labor did not go entirely unnoticed by the desolate community. Every evening, just as the bitter cold began to freeze the muddy earth solid, Mildred would drive her rusted pickup truck aggressively up the cracked driveway. The diner owner brought warmth. She carried heavy aluminum foil-wrapped trays of roasted chicken, thick steaming slabs of homemade meatloaf, and massive 3-pound blueberry pies baked fresh from her struggling, grease-stained kitchen. She absolutely refused to accept a single penny from Abram's pathetic, empty leather wallet, her loud, boisterous voice cutting sharply through the heavy, stoic silence of the ruined house with genuine, uncalculated kindness. She would sit closely with Cora on the sagging front porch, wrapping a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket around the older woman's shoulders, pouring scalding hot coffee from a dented metal thermos, while Abram and Leo ate their massive meals in quiet, starving reverence.
On the 14th day, the external structure of the heavy Victorian house was finally secured against the brutal winter winds. The massive, sagging front porch was entirely stabilized with heavy 6x6 solid wooden posts, and the dangerous gaping holes in the heavy slate roof were perfectly sealed against the freezing rain. Abram finally turned his sharp, measuring eyes back toward the dark, narrow confines of the third floor. He carried a heavy forged steel crowbar and a massive 20-ounce framing hammer up the winding, creaking wooden staircase, his heavy boots echoing loudly through the empty, cavernous halls. Leo followed closely behind, carrying a heavy brass flashlight. They reached the tight, suffocating landing where the ceiling sloped violently down, standing shoulder to shoulder in the pitch-black hallway. Leo aimed the bright, piercing beam of light directly at the flat, unremarkable wall, covered entirely in the faded, water-stained floral wallpaper. He looked at the old man in absolute confusion, seeing nothing but a dead end, a solid barrier that supposedly marked the absolute architectural limit of the massive structure. Abram raised the heavy steel hammer. "There is a massive void completely hidden behind this plaster," Abram stated quietly, his intense eyes locked onto the microscopic half-inch misalignment of the painted rose petals that betrayed the entire illusion. "It is a hidden space measuring exactly 14 feet deep and 22 feet wide, a massive volume of square footage completely unaccounted for in the exterior framing dimensions." He swung the heavy hammer forward. The solid steel head smashed violently into the ancient, brittle plaster with a deafening, thunderous crack that shook the heavy floorboards completely beneath their boots. A massive cloud of thick, choking gray dust exploded violently into the narrow hallway, blinding their eyes and filling their lungs. Abram absolutely did not stop. He swung the heavy tool again and again, his muscular arms driving the unforgiving metal straight through the wooden lath, tearing away massive, jagged chunks of the false wall with a relentless mechanical fury. Leo stepped quickly forward, wedging the sharp, curved end of the heavy iron crowbar directly into the gaping hole, throwing his entire body weight violently backward to pry the heavy, hidden studs away from the ancient framing. The wall fought back fiercely. Decades of dried, hardened adhesive and rusted iron nails shrieked in violent, agonizing protest against the massive leverage of the steel tools, but the two men absolutely refused to yield. They worked in absolute synchronized harmony, ripping the heavy deception away piece by painful piece, their faces covered entirely in thick, suffocating white dust, their heavy breathing echoing loudly over the violent sound of breaking wood. With one final massive heave of the iron crowbar, the last remaining section of the heavy plaster collapsed completely inward, falling heavily to the unseen floor below with a hollow, echoing crash. The dust slowly settled in the freezing air. Leo shined the bright beam of his brass flashlight straight through the jagged, violent opening, his eyes widening in absolute paralyzing shock. Hidden perfectly behind the shattered plaster, completely preserved in the suffocating darkness of the sealed void, stood a magnificent, heavy, solid oak door.
It was entirely untouched by the rotting decay that had consumed the rest of the house, its heavy iron hinges completely free of rust, its polished surface completely smooth and flawless. It was locked. Abram reached his calloused, bleeding hand carefully through the broken wall, running his rough fingers meticulously along the top edge of the heavy wooden doorframe. His highly trained hands felt a small, unnatural bump hidden completely out of sight beneath a thick layer of dust. He closed his heavy fist, pulling down a heavy, ornate brass key that had been secretly placed there over 60 decades ago by a person desperately trying to protect something completely irreplaceable from the greedy hands of the outside world. He slid the heavy brass key into the intricate iron keyhole. He turned the cold metal. The heavy internal tumbler snapped back with a sharp, echoing click. The massive oak door drifted open on silent, perfectly balanced hinges, and a freezing, stagnant blast of trapped air rushed violently out into the hallway, carrying with it the undeniable, heavy scent of 60-year-old piano varnish.
The heavy oak door swung inward. Abram stepped across the ancient threshold, sweeping the bright beam of his brass flashlight across a massive, completely sealed chamber measuring exactly 22 feet wide and 14 feet deep. The air inside was freezing, sitting stagnant at exactly 38 degrees Fahrenheit, yet it was completely devoid of the suffocating, toxic black mold and rotting wood that had relentlessly consumed the rest of the decaying mansion. The heavy plaster walls were absolutely immaculate. The polished oak floorboards gleamed with a pristine, undisturbed finish, preserved entirely within a flawless, airtight vacuum created by the thick layers of masonry and solid wood. There was absolutely no dust. In the exact center of the vast, silent room stood a massive, towering silhouette draped entirely beneath a heavy, yellowed linen sheet. Abram walked forward slowly, his heavy work boots echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. He reached out with his calloused, blistered right hand, gripping the edge of the fragile fabric. He pulled it violently backward. The old linen tore with a sharp, ripping sound, falling heavily to the floor to reveal a breathtaking 9-foot absolute masterpiece of human engineering. It was a concert grand piano. The heavy cast iron plate, the flawless ebony finish, and the 88 pristine ivory keys gleamed brilliantly under the pale beam of the flashlight, radiating an overwhelming, silent majesty that completely defied the relentless passage of time. It was a magnificent Steinway instrument, entirely untouched, perfectly preserved, and waiting patiently in the suffocating darkness for over 6 decades. "Fetch Cora," Abram commanded softly. Leo nodded quickly, turning and running down the narrow, dark staircase to find the old woman. Abram walked past the magnificent instrument, his sharp eyes locking on to a solid mahogany writing desk sitting quietly in the far corner of the sealed room. The heavy wooden surface was completely covered with thousands of meticulously handwritten musical notation. The papers were stacked into neat, perfectly aligned piles, secured tightly with faded leather ribbons. In the absolute center of the mystery desk rested a heavy, yellowed envelope, sealed with cracked red wax, alongside a small, dark blue leather booklet. Abram picked up the envelope. He broke the ancient, brittle wax seal, unfolding a thick piece of heavy parchment paper dated specifically in the year 1959. He heard the slow, agonizing sound of heavy footsteps climbing the creaking wooden stairs. Cora walked slowly into the sealed room, her deformed, arthritic hands clutching her heavy wool blanket tightly against her chest, her tired eyes widening in absolute paralyzing shock at the sight of the magnificent Steinway piano. Abram looked directly into his wife's eyes. He began to read the letter out loud, his deep, steady voice vibrating heavily through the freezing air.
"To whoever finally breaks the seal of this tomb," Abram read, calmly, holding the faded paper tightly. "My name is Beatrice. I have sealed this room entirely to protect the magnificent, tragic legacy of my daughter, Josephine. She passed away exactly 1 year ago at the fragile age of 19. She was a brilliant, unmatched piano prodigy, destined to conquer the greatest concert halls of the world, until a horrific carriage accident crushed her left hand entirely at the age of 16. Cora gasped quietly. "She lost the ability to stretch her fingers," Abram continued reading, his voice laced with a profound, heavy sorrow. "Her joints were violently destroyed, permanently fixed in a twisted, deformed state. The world coldly told her that she would never touch the ivory keys again. She absolutely refused to listen." Abram looked down at the massive stacks of paper. For the last 3 agonizing years of her short life, Josephine locked herself inside this very room, Abram read, his eyes tracing the desperate ink-stained words. She painstakingly composed exactly 43 original sonatas. She mathematically re-engineered the heavy chord structures, meticulously altering the vast melodic reaches. She designed this entire library of music specifically for hands that are violently crippled, deformed by severe arthritis, or entirely broken by the brutal cruelty of fate. It is a masterpiece built entirely on the foundation of immense suffering. The room fell completely silent. Abram reached down to the desk, picking up the small, dark blue leather booklet. He opened the fragile cover, his sharp eyes scanning the faded ink of an official bank ledger. "I leave these 43 compositions to you, and I leave you this savings account, established in 1958, containing exactly $800, meant solely to ensure that Josephine's heavy, beautiful triumph over despair will eventually be heard by the world." The revelation hung heavy in the air. A brilliant 19-year-old girl, dead for over 60 years, had spent her final agonizing days engineering a miraculous mathematical salvation for a 72-year-old woman she would never actually meet. It was an overwhelming, profound collision of destiny, a magnificent, silent victory over the cold, pragmatic cruelty of men like Desmond, who discarded the broken and the old without a single ounce of hesitation. Cora walked slowly toward the piano. Her breathing grew shallow, her deformed, heavily swollen fingers trembling violently as she sat down on the heavy, tufted leather bench. She stared at the pristine ivory keys, the heavy weight of 60 years of silence pressing intensely against her chest. She had not played a single note in 5 agonizing years, convinced completely that her musical soul was dead and permanently buried. She reached out. She placed her twisted, ruined hand softly on the cold ivory keys. She pressed down. A rich, flawless, breathtaking chord exploded violently from the heavy iron frame, the massive sound waves echoing beautifully against the solid oak walls without a single fraction of hesitation. The music was engineered with absolute brilliant perfection, requiring no wide stretches, no agonizing leaps, and absolutely no painful contortions. Cora closed her eyes, tears of pure, overwhelming salvation finally falling silently down her wrinkled cheeks as a complex, majestic melody flowed effortlessly from her broken hands. It was perfect. Abram stood completely still in the dark shadows, listening to the magnificent, heavy sounds of absolute resurrection filling the dead house. And as he looked down at the small blue booklet containing a seemingly insignificant deposit of $800 from 1958, his sharp, calculating mind immediately realized that he needed to march straight to the county bank tomorrow morning to trigger a massive, unavoidable financial explosion. The heavy glass doors of the Caulfield County Bank swung open. Abram walked slowly across the polished marble floor, his worn leather work boots leaving a faint trail of dried dirt against the pristine stone. He bypassed the standard tellers entirely, walking with the quiet, unyielding authority of a man who possessed absolute, undeniable certainty. He stepped directly into the open office of the branch manager, placing the fragile, dark blue leather booklet firmly onto the polished mahogany desk. The manager, a heavy-set man wearing a heavily starched suit, looked up with an expression of profound, arrogant irritation. He opened the faded pages. His condescending smirk vanished instantly. The manager typed the ancient account numbers into his computer keyboard, staring blankly at the glowing monitor as 66 years of forgotten, buried financial history rapidly materialized before his very eyes. The original deposit was exactly $800, secured tightly within an ironclad trust fund in 1958. It had been left completely undisturbed, quietly accumulating massive, uninterrupted compound interest through decades of shifting economic tides and forgotten generations. "This account holds exactly $127,000.41, the manager stammered weakly, his hands shaking violently as he looked at the old man in faded flannel. Abram did not smile. He calmly instructed the terrified man to transfer the massive sum into a secure, newly established account, securing their absolute financial independence without a single vulgar display of celebration. While Abram secured the immense cash reserves, a completely different kind of monumental valuation was occurring back inside the freezing walls of the decaying Victorian mansion. 3 highly distinguished musicology professors from the State University, wearing heavy wool overcoats and thick reading glasses, stood completely paralyzed inside the sealed third-floor chamber. They stared intensely at the 43 handwritten sonatas. Cora sat silently at the magnificent Steinway, her severely deformed fingers executing the complex, brilliantly engineered chords with absolute, breathtaking precision. The lead professor, a man who had spent 40 agonizing years studying the historical evolution of classical compositions, slowly removed his heavy wire-rimmed glasses. His hands trembled as he realized he was witnessing a fundamental paradigm shift in human capability. The brilliant, tragic teenager had inadvertently invented a completely revolutionary method of therapeutic music education designed entirely for joints severely damaged by arthritis and trauma. The historical significance of this archive is completely unprecedented, the professor whispered softly, his voice echoing sharply against the solid oak walls. Within 48 hours, the university legal team drafted a massive ironclad proposal. The exclusive copyright licensing, the international publishing rights, and the immediate creation of an academic foundation built entirely around Josephine's mathematical methodology generated a staggering, uncompromising financial valuation. The forgotten musical collection was officially appraised at exactly $1,500,000. The scales of justice had violently tipped. Just 3 agonizing weeks prior, Abram and Cora had been ruthlessly discarded by their own flesh and blood, driven out into the freezing wind with a pathetic, insulting total of exactly $64 hiding in a frayed leather wallet. Now, through the sheer force of their stoic endurance, their quiet dignity, and their absolute refusal to surrender to a corrupt world, they stood as legitimate, indisputable millionaires. They had transformed a completely worthless $12 ruin into a magnificent, towering empire of historical preservation. The state newspapers immediately printed the extraordinary story in bold, heavy black ink. The intoxicating, heavy scent of millions of dollars drifted rapidly across the county lines, reaching the cold, sterile corporate office of the exact man who had callously thrown them away. Desmond sat perfectly still behind his expansive glass desk, reading the printed headlines with a sickening, dark greed instantly reigniting within his hollow, worthless chest. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, marching furiously toward his private parking garage. He slammed his heavy foot down on the accelerator. He steered his expensive, heated luxury car down the long highway toward the dying town, completely unaware that his desperate, pathetic attempt to manipulate his parents and steal this massive new fortune was about to collide violently with an unyielding wall of absolute karma.
The heavy, aggressive roar of a massive 8-cylinder engine shattered the quiet, freezing morning of Prosper Street. A sleek, black luxury sedan worth over $90,000 rolled arrogantly over the cracked asphalt, its massive tires crushing the dead weeds. The heavy vehicle slammed to a violent halt in front of the Victorian mansion. Desmond stepped out into the bitter 38-degree Fahrenheit chill. He wore a heavy, tailored cashmere overcoat, his hair slicked back with expensive oils, his face twisted into a carefully practiced mask of pathetic, fabricated remorse. He was not alone. Walking closely behind him was a wealthy corporate investor, a man wearing a dark charcoal suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase loaded with thick, predatory contracts designed specifically to immediately liquidate the $1,500,000 musical copyright. Desmond looked up at the massive wooden structure. He expected to see a rotting, collapsing tomb filled with desperate, starving parents begging for a warm bed. Instead, he stared in absolute, paralyzing confusion at the perfectly aligned 6x6 solid oak porch columns, the completely repaired slate roof, and the heavy, undeniable presence of absolute structural integrity. The house was no longer a ruin. It was a flawless fortress. Desmond climbed the heavy wooden steps. He pushed the massive front door open without knocking, marching straight through the grand foyer with the suffocating arrogance of a man who believed he owned the entire world. He followed the breathtaking, flawless sound of the Steinway grand piano echoing heavily down from the 3rd floor. He climbed the creaking staircase, his leather shoes slipping slightly on the dust-free wood, until he stood in the doorway of the sealed chamber. Abram stood silently in the corner, his heavy, calloused hands resting calmly on the handle of a steel framing hammer. He wore the exact same faded denim jeans and worn flannel shirt he had worn on the day he was brutally evicted, his posture radiating the absolute unyielding density of a load-bearing pillar. Cora sat gracefully at the magnificent piano. Her deformed fingers danced flawlessly across the pristine ivory keys, completely ignoring her treacherous son. Desmond stepped into the room. "Mother, Father, I have been looking everywhere for you." Desmond lied smoothly, injecting a pathetic, sickening warmth into his deceitful voice. "It was a terrible misunderstanding. I have come to bring you back home, to properly manage this incredible new asset as a united family." Abram did not blink. He simply stared at the 45-year-old man who had ruthlessly discarded them for exactly $64, watching the hollow greed burning fiercely behind Desmond's eyes. The corporate investors stepped forward eagerly, pulling a thick stack of printed commercial contracts from his heavy leather briefcase. "We have secured top-tier buyers for the property and the exclusive rights to the 43 sonatas," Desmond continued rapidly, his voice dripping with toxic, manufactured excitement. "We can finalize the sale today, split the profits equitably among the brothers, and ensure you both live comfortably." Cora stopped playing. The sudden, absolute silence in the massive chamber was deafening.
pressing down on Desmond's chest like a physical weight. She slowly closed the heavy wooden lid over the pristine ivory keys. She did not scream, she did not cry, and she absolutely did not rise from the heavy leather bench. She sat with the terrifying, majestic stillness of a queen judging a traitor. She turned her head. "You did not come to bring us home," Cora stated coldly, her voice sharp and perfectly measured. "You came to scavenge the bones of a ghost, just as you scavenged the bones of your own family." Desmond forced a pathetic, nervous laugh. "Mother, please be reasonable." "You stole it," Cora interrupted smoothly, her tone carrying absolutely no anger, only the freezing, unforgiving weight of absolute truth. "On the morning you forced us onto the street, I realized my grandmother's gold wedding ring was missing from the heavy wooden dresser. It was an antique piece, passed down through 4 generations, carrying the immense weight of our family history." Desmond swallowed hard. The corporate investor shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the sweating, nervous man standing beside him. "I spent 3 hours sitting on the floor of a dying diner. I used the last few coins from your father's pocket to use a public rotary phone. I found every single pawn shop in a 50-mile radius. I found it." Desmond took a small step backward. "You sold a priceless family heirloom for exactly $400. Cora whispered harshly, the terrible number hanging in the freezing air like a bloody executioner's blade. "You sold my grandmother's legacy for pocket change to buy new tires for your luxury car." Desmond's face drained entirely of blood. He opened his mouth to formulate a desperate, cowardly lie, but Abram moved from the shadows. The old man stepped forward with the heavy, terrifying inevitability of a collapsing mountain. He reached into his chest pocket, pulling out a thick, legally binding document stamped heavily with the official seal of the county courthouse. He slammed the heavy paper down on the mahogany desk. The sharp, violent crack echoed like a gunshot. "This is the official, irreversible deed of the Josephine Trust," Abram declared steadily, his voice rumbling with deep, quiet authority. "It legally protects the entire $127,041.47, as well as the complete copyright of the musical library." The investor leaned forward eagerly, reading the heavy black ink. "Read Section 4. Abram commanded coldly. The investor traced his manicured finger down the page, reading the unyielding legal parameters established over 60 years ago by a grieving mother. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he read the ironclad clause out loud. "The trust strictly and absolutely forbids any personal commercialization, liquidation, or profit distribution to private individuals. All generated wealth must be strictly dedicated to the preservation of therapeutic musical education." The money was completely untouchable. It was a permanent, unbreakable legal fortress. The investor immediately recognized the toxic, radioactive nature of the situation. He realized he had been dragged into a pathetic, deceitful family feud by a desperate, greedy liar who completely lacked any legal authority or moral standing. The wealthy man aggressively shoved his predatory contracts back into his heavy leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a loud, final click. "You lied to me about your legal ownership, and you lied to me about your parents," the investor spat furiously, glaring at Desmond with absolute disgust. "Do not ever contact my firm again." The investor turned sharply on his heel. He walked rapidly out of the room, his heavy shoes echoing down the wooden staircase, leaving Desmond entirely alone in the freezing, absolute silence of his own monumental failure. The 45-year-old man stood paralyzed in the center of the massive room, completely stripped of his arrogant power, his pathetic lies utterly exposed, and his greedy soul laid bare before the unbreakable dignity of the parents he had tried to destroy. Desmond looked at his father. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for a single word of forgiveness, a shred of the unconditional love he had so recklessly burned to ashes. Abram simply stared back with the cold, unfeeling eyes of a master builder inspecting a fundamentally rotten piece of scrap wood. There was absolutely nothing left to salvage. "Get out," Abram ordered quietly. It was not a request. It was an absolute physical law. Desmond broke. He lowered his head, his expensive cashmere coat suddenly looking like a heavy, suffocating shroud of shame. He turned around, his shoulders slumping violently forward, and began the long, humiliating descent down the creaking staircase. He walked out of the massive front door, stepping down off the perfectly leveled porch, and climbed silently back into his expensive luxury car. He drove away in absolute disgrace. Inside the magnificent, dust-free chamber, the toxic, oppressive energy vanished entirely, instantly replaced by the pure, freezing breath of absolute freedom. The vile infection of greed had been permanently purged from the ancient wood. Abram walked slowly toward the piano, his heavy work boots moving gently across the floorboards. He placed his rough, calloused hand tenderly onto his wife's shoulder, feeling the steady, rhythmic breathing of a woman who had just fought the greatest battle of her life without ever raising her voice. She was victorious. Cora slowly lifted the heavy wooden lid once more, exposing the pristine ivory keys, fully prepared to use this massive, untouched fortune to unleash a profound, healing light on a broken world. The brutal, freezing winter eventually surrendered to a gentle 65-degree Fahrenheit spring breeze, washing away the heavy layers of gray snow from the Caulfield County roads. The $12 rune on Prosper Street was no longer a decaying, terrifying tomb of forgotten memories and rotting wood. It had been completely transformed, meticulously restored by Abram's heavily calloused hands and uncompromising vision, into a breathtaking, magnificent sanctuary known officially across the state as the Josephine and Cora Music Foundation. The heavy oak doors remained permanently unlocked, inviting the entire broken community inside. The massive parlor, once buried beneath inches of toxic black dirt and shattered glass, was now filled entirely with the bright, ringing laughter of disabled children and the quiet, grateful smiles of elderly citizens suffering from severe, crippling arthritis. They did not keep a single penny of the massive fortune for their own selfish desires. The wealth was poured entirely into the careful, methodical restoration of broken souls, providing free, world-class musical therapy to anyone who had been told by society that their damaged hands were completely useless. Across the freshly paved asphalt driveway, a 17-year-old boy loaded 2 heavy canvas bags into the trunk of a reliable, newly purchased sedan. Leo was finally leaving. Abram stood silently beside the young man, handing him a thick, securely sealed envelope containing a fully paid 4-year tuition receipt for the heavy structural engineering program at the State University. The old man had also secured top-tier, round-the-clock medical care for the boy's suffering grandmother, completely removing the crushing, suffocating weight of poverty from the teenager's thin, exhausted shoulders. Leo looked directly into the old man's sharp, measuring eyes, his own vision blurring slightly with a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He firmly shook Abram's rough, scarred hand, silently promising to build his entire future with the exact same flawless, quarter-inch precision he had learned while ripping apart false walls within this ancient, unyielding house. A brilliant golden sunset descended slowly over the small town. Inside the grand, beautifully illuminated parlor, Cora sat gracefully on the heavy leather bench of the magnificent Steinway grand piano. She was exactly 72 years old, her posture radiating an absolute, quiet majesty. Her painfully deformed fingers, completely freed from the agonizing restrictive limitations of her aggressive disease by the brilliant mind of a tragically lost teenager, glided effortlessly across the 88 pristine ivory keys. She played one of Josephine's brilliant, mathematically engineered sonatas, a heavy, breathtaking composition that transformed immense physical suffering into absolute, undeniable acoustic beauty. The rich, flawless sound waves rolled powerfully out through the massive open bay windows, washing over the cracked sidewalks of the dying town, breathing a profound, undeniable life back into the desolate, forgotten streets. Abram stood quietly on the solid wooden porch. He leaned heavily against a perfectly plumb 6x6 oak column, folding his rough, dirt-stained hands over his broad chest, and smiled with absolute peaceful serenity as he listened to the music of his wife's resurrected soul. From a pathetic, insulting $64 left rotting in a frayed leather wallet, and the cold, unfeeling cruelty of a selfish son who measured human worth strictly by corporate bank ledgers, they have proven an unbreakable, eternal truth. Never underestimate quiet people and discarded things, because sometimes only when thrown into the deepest, most unforgiving silence do the greatest melodies of life truly begin.